Hey, welcome to the Afikra podcast. My name is Mikey Mhenna. Today on this series, we have Alia Al-Senussi, who is a cultural strategist, a patron of the arts, an academic and lecturer, whose PhD was on the subject of cultural patronage and contemporary art in Saudi Arabia, and was involved with the book Art in Saudi Arabia, A New Creative Economy, ? Alia, welcome to Afikra.
Thank you, Mikey. So happy to be with you.
Okay, so growing up, I'm curious about your relationship to the, quote unquote, art world. What was your relationship to art as a kid?
Really, I think, the standard cultural tourist, you go to a new city, you see the museums. And I think that's actually a really wonderful way to be introduced to art. Of course, certain families are very deeply involved in arts and culture and are collectors and, are committed to that as a part of their daily life. My parents, always believed in the power of art and culture and that it was important. But, I grew up mostly kind of say Cairo, then San Diego, bouncing around the world. It was really about, going to a museum when you went to a new city or when you went to that city. So in London, you had the National Gallery, the British Museum. You didn't even have the Tate Modern. So I would say contemporary art was really not a part of my life in the sense that I didn't even probably know what would be the difference between modern and contemporary art as we discuss it now, and of course, which is a daily part of my life,
Yeah,
understanding those differences and that bifurcation really. Um, but museums were important, and they were an important gateway and an important way to understand that city, that culture, but also global culture.
yeah. Okay, so I'm going to ask you that question that you probably get asked all the time, but I think it's a useful little tidbit, a little soundbite for folks who don't spend much time thinking about art. What is the difference between modern art and contemporary art, and why um, should people be paying attention to contemporary art from their world?
So modern arts, I mean, I think there's a pretty standard definition of when modern art ends and when contemporary art begins. I in my head and how I just interpret it for myself, modern art is art that's made, kind of in the mid 20th century. Uh, so let's talk about like Mark Rothko, um, artists of that ilk, Robert Rauschenberg. So that to me is modern art. Perhaps Picasso. Um, but then contemporary art is the art being made in your moment, in the now, by artists that are living and breathing and part of your culture, your daily life. I think contemporary art to me is incredibly important. And I think we should look at it, especially in what is happening in the Arab world, because artists are responding to the world that they live and see around them. And artists are the interpreters of our time. And you can use I work in the visual arts, but artists are also, writers, are poets, are people working in being creative. And I think especially as I said, what the kind of horrors we're witnessing at the moment, um, artists are the only way we can really begin to fathom what is happening and should be respected as such.
Yeah. Um, it's like I'm curious about the functions of museums. Um, you did your PhD in politics as it relates to art. And I think a lot of people might have a hard time understanding how one discipline relates to the other. Um, can you talk about the importance of museums as kind of these like soft power instruments um,
Mhm.
when you think about political expression in the Arab world?
A great museum to me is one of the most powerful tools we have to understanding the world around us, but also to changing the way people may see it. I think, Tate Modern is an institution I hold extremely dear to my heart, to my brain, and to what I want to see in the world. Tate Modern completely deconstructed what we think of as the museum in the sense that you walk into many other institutions, or let's say encyclopedic institutions that you have around the world. You have the Greek wing, you have the Roman wing, you have the Asian wing, you have like the Japan room. And what Tate Modern did when it opened in 2000 was no, it brought art together around themes. And so you have a room about the horrors of war with a, artist talking about the pogroms in Eastern Europe. And then you have an artist talking about the Holocaust with an artist talking about Saber and Shatila. And, this makes these themes universal rather than separating us as humans. It makes it about how we share, common, uh, common life subjects and life matters.
So I wonder how those, I mean, not to ask you to say, to say the history of museums in the Arab world, but how much have how much have sort of we evolved or changed in the region insofar as from the perspective of producing and creating those types of institutions? Like in the 80s, how many of these great museums existed in the Arab world versus today?
Sadly, I think the Arab world has unfortunately not embraced or understood the power of the museum to help preserve our culture, but also to help advance and heal. I think so often, you'll hear, well, why would we build a museum? We need to build roads and schools first. Um, that isn't, I can understand somebody saying that, and I understand the validity of that point. But I say, no, you need to be building museums alongside building your schools and your roads because the museums are what make a city and a society and a civilization. We can't only aspire to uh, to kind of a basic way of living. You need to have things that make you understand who you are. Because frankly, only when you understand who you are do you then think, okay, well, let me throw away the trash in the trash bin, not throw it on the street. Let me respect the city that I'm living in. Let me love my neighbor because we share this commonality. So I think I can understand why people say that, but I definitely push back on.
Yeah. Who do you think is doing it well, or who do you think has done it well across the region over the last 40 years?
Well, I mean, I can't talk, maybe perhaps not the last 40 years, but what I would say is, what's Beirut, you have these incredible institutions and even small museums and small art spaces, the Sursock. And I think what is incredible actually about this moment is that, a lot of them were heavily damaged in the blast. And, immediately you see a campaign to rebuild because the appreciation of what they meant to the city was there. And
Yeah.
of course, you also have to rebuild the city, but you have to rebuild the things that make that city, Beirut. And then you see what's happening in Sharjah and Abu Dhabi and Doha, and all very unique and very different. So each one of those institutions, a very different model to each other. But I think really incredibly important to those places. I have been to Doha several times, and I unfortunately haven't been um, after the World Cup. So I know that like there was this huge moment really like kind of preparing the city for the World Cup. But I'd love to go back and see what has happened. But I mean, I was able to visit the Museum of Islamic Art, which is one of the most beautiful, contemplative, just special, really spiritual experiences.
Yeah. How much of if you were to put together like a do's and don'ts, you sit on the boards of you sit on many boards related to many different museums. And you're a strategic advisor and cultural advisor to ministries. And do you have like a sort of a back of the envelope do's and don'ts when it comes to putting
Um,
together a museum or putting together one of these cultural
I think
institutions? Like,
Well, I think that, there are certain ways of building a collection, and I think that you see certain institutions doing that really well and others not. And I think, you need to building a museum collection is completely different than the things on my wall,
why?
me as a
How?
private collector, as a private home. A museum has a responsibility, but also has a duty to show things to the public, well, and also has the space in a very different way. And a public collection is completely different to a private collection. A public collection is about interpreting themes for a society for a moment in time. Um, your private collection could be thematic. I mean, it could be like, people now have collections that are very much based on one theme or one type of art, female artists, from a certain period in time, artists working in a certain theme, which can be very, provocative or very domestic. And so people would choose that for their own homes. Museums, on the other hand, as public institutions, and especially when you talk about public museums rather than, let's say, a private museum, so, there is a proliferation of private museums in the world, and that's its own subject of whether or not people should just support the institutions that they already have, or whether or not with those funds they should make their own museum. And actually, within the series of the book that I helped with, is Hot Topics in the Art World, there's an entire book on the subject of the private museum and whether that's, a good or a bad thing. But I'd say public museums and public institutions with public, especially when they're using public money, have a responsibility and have a very different way of collecting. And I would say that as much as it's really, we live in a world where it's like you want everything all the time right now, building a thoughtful collection takes time, and it requires different voices. And it also requires really thoughtful voices, sets of voices to come together and, to say what is appropriate for that institution.
Yeah. It's interesting, this idea of like acquisition, um, acquisition of a museum collection. And I never really thought about the playbook, right? But how long do you think? What is an appropriate time for a new museum to spend acquiring a collection? Um, and like, should they be focusing only on local stuff? Like, should they be focusing on like attracting tourists? Like, what are you supposed to do? What is the playbook?
Well, I think it's completely different in every context. I mean, I think,
Yeah,
I don't know, for example, if you look at Abu Dhabi, you
yeah,
have plans for, let's just look at the two the most clear examples, the ones that I know the best. The Louvre Abu Dhabi and the upcoming Guggenheim, two
yeah,
completely different types of institutions, right? So the Louvre Abu Dhabi is, began as a project utilizing one of the most important and oldest collections in the world of the Louvre, and then building that up and kind of thematically around the subject of um, three civilizations, or let's say three type of religions. You walk in there, and it's very much about the strand of how we're all united. And now, of course, you have the Abrahamic Center. So it's very clearly like historical collection with a small section at the back, contemporary art. But the most of it is this historic collection. Then you have the Guggenheim Abu Dhabi, which is being built as we speak, on the same in the same near premises. And of course, they're both about attracting tourists, but they're also about looking and preserving works of contemporary art. So Guggenheim is very much about modern and contemporary art, and about telling that story to the public, educating that public. And, of what I have heard and seen of what the Guggenheim has done, building a world-class collection. And are they going to go buy, you know, the greatest Rothkos that ever existed? Maybe one, I'm not sure actually. But no, they're not able to, because those works already exist in other collections. So instead, the Guggenheim is focusing on works that they know are of the utmost quality, and of a different moment, a different period, works from around the Arab world. So incredible works of Iraqi modernism, incredible works of Chinese contemporary art, looking at what they can find that is of the best quality, and then they can teach the public in that way.
yeah. It is really interesting because you hear criticisms of institutions, right? Not naming names, but there are criticisms like, oh, they're just shipping in a collection from here or there. And I always wonder, like, what is the right way of doing it?
Some of the
Let's
best museums in the world bought collections. I mean,
Yeah.
you have like major collections that like, were gifted or brought in. I mean, the British Museum, I mean, I mean, I'm sitting here in London thinking of all these museums that really, did start by, kind of one individual with like a bequest. So I would say
Mm,
that type of criticism is unfounded and not perhaps the most useful. There are other criticisms that, we can discuss and talk about the ways in which things can't just be oh, here, let's just find this. um, but I'd say that lots of collections and museum collections started by one great collector.
yeah. Um, we're going to talk more about Saudi and the rest of the Gulf later, but we haven't talked at all about North Africa. What are some of the great sort of museums or collections from North Africa that um, people should at least like have on their map? Of like, hey, listen, these are some institutions worth checking out.
Well, I miss the old Egyptian museum. I miss being able, and I know like as museum officials would like be horrified to say this, but I loved being able to walk around in Tahrir Square and that incredible crumbling old villa. And I mean, just thinking to yourself, you could just like take that object right there and you can touch everything, which is like not okay. But there's something so incredibly romantic and amazing that you're surrounded by these, ancient objects and in this way. But I mean, I think, when you look at what's happening in Marrakesh, so I'm very involved. I'm on the board of 154, and you see, these smaller private institutions coming up. You have Macau,
Yeah,
which is created by Othman Lazrak and family, such a special place. The kind of renovation of the Yves Saint Laurent museum, and you have this vibrancy of also craft and culture in Morocco, which I find so heartening because I think, I have these objects actually here at home, like these beautiful mother of pearl trays and backgammon sets that you buy in Beirut, and in Morocco. And actually, craft is really respected there and really a part of everyday life. You have artists giving back, like Hassan Hajjaj, who kind of has created this own community around him and around himself, and really supporting so many people. I mean, you walk into his studio at any given time, and there's always somebody there. He's helping or hosting or showing or doing. So I think very, very special. And Tunisia, I think, I went to Tunisia just after the Arab Spring. And a friend of mine was like, oh, if you'd come before, you'd have seen it. And it's so different now. Like, and I'm kind of sad. And I was like, I think Tunisia is incredible. I think, the Bardo, and I think Selma Feriani Gallery, she's opening this grand new space in January. And actually, that's its own topic, is that in the context of the Arab world, you see it almost everywhere, is that private individuals with like private commercial enterprises really fill the void of what you would think a public institution to be. So you have somebody like Selma Feriani who serves that purpose in Tunis. You have Mohammed Hafiz Athar Gallery in Saudi. Of course, now Saudi is undergoing this immense cultural regeneration, and there will be museums, there will be more public institutions. But until now, you had Athar Gallery that was everything. It was a commercial gallery, it was an artist hub, it was a hangout spot, it was a cafe, it was a bookstore, it was it was everything. Artist residencies. I mean, they had to do it all. So, you have to fill that void. And you see that in Beirut, and you
yeah.
see that with so many of the galleries and spaces that really have to do it all.
I think about this a bunch. Like in places like Saudi, right? You just mentioned Athletic Gallery, and for those listening, that's ATHR. If you want to look them up, um, privately run, right? So this is a private initiative. This is a private citizen and who has put their energy into creating this institution, especially in an environment that was sort of devoid from public support for these types of initiatives, right? And so they work to fill the
Mm.
void. and create these types of organizations. In Saudi now, there's a huge emphasis on the arts, which we're about to go into. I wonder if there has been a precedent, or if there is a precedent and a pattern of those types of private initiatives being swallowed and sort of being sort of killed essentially because of the deluge of public support. And so I don't know if in other places around the world where that has happened, if you see those types of
Mhm.
things happening, and if that's a risk that we need to think about.
Well, I would say maybe looking at things that have happened in China, but really there really has never been anything like what we're witnessing now in Saudi in that way. But I would say in terms of like kind of this idea of public support, um, discouraging people from starting their own private initiatives, people say there is that fear in different parts of the world. But then on the other hand, you see what's happening right now in Germany, which I find absolutely bone chilling. And that, voices are being silenced because there's this idea that there's so much public support and the government can just switch it on and switch it off. And artist run spaces are being, shut, voices are being silenced. And that is the other side of that spectrum. Um, but you haven't really witnessed at all what we're seeing in Saudi now. If anything, the only, kind of fear I have, and that has been something I worry about for a long time, is that there's still just a lack of private collecting. You don't have private collectors. You, of course, have now the government supporting these large scale government, let's say, commissions and, public art. But you need private collectors to create a sustainable ecosystem. So if we can talk about the art world, we can equally talk about the art world ecosystem. One of my favorite phrases on topics. And, as somebody who has been deeply involved with Art Basel and seen now the evolution of Art Basel Miami Beach, so I wasn't there from the beginning, but then Art Basel Hong Kong from day one, um, the reason those cities and those initiatives in Art Basel is so successful is because there's a healthy ecosystem in those places.
Yeah, it makes sense. I mean, you're right that there's like no precedent for it. I think on a smaller scale, it might be worthwhile to look at the UAE and sort of see what happened over the last 20 years in the UAE, but there is no precedent. So maybe that let's use that as an opportunity to talk about not only this book that you help support, art in Saudi Arabia, a new creative economy, but Saudi in general, as you've been involved with the Ministry of Culture in Saudi for years now. Um, so maybe the first question is, if I asked you 10 years ago, 2013, uh, if I said to you, "Hey, listen, there's going to be this sort of like cultural revolution in Saudi, and there's going to be a lot of changes happening." I didn't tell you what changes, but I said there's going to be a lot of changes happening, um, and asked you, "What do you think the art world would look like in 2023?" Um, what do you think it would have looked like, and compare that to where we are now?
I would have said if you're telling me there are changes coming,
Yeah, I said
I would
there
have
are
said,
changes, but who knows what
yeah,
they are?
yeah. Like I would say more private collectors. So I would say in one way, what we're witnessing now is obviously so incredible and so positive. And I will say again, like again, when we kind of look around the world, and I don't mean just the Arab world, around the world, what is happening in so many other places, it is so horrifying and depressing. That Saudi to me is this like bright shining light of
Mhm.
positivity in the way in which women's lives are changing, artists' lives are changing, people's lives are changing. Um, but my one disappointment would be that you don't have more private collectors. But what's amazing is that you have this unbelievable push by Mohammed bin Salman, by Prince Badr, um, the Ministry of Culture, to support arts and culture, and that is something deeply important. And then we hope to see in then 10 years the fruits of that labor.
What are the fruits? What do you think? What are you hoping? What fruits do you hope that this tree bears?
I think that there's just a sense of pride in society. You see people,
Mm,
more active, doing things, starting new initiatives, so there's a sense of hope and there's a sense of also that your future is limitless. One of my best friends, she just started a makeup company, because she's a committed entrepreneur and, you know, I don't I can almost guarantee you she would never have thought she could do that or would do that 10 years ago. But with the changes happening now, that is possible. People can, dress a certain way. People can go open restaurants. I mean, you see people becoming entrepreneurs. And something I always remember is the first time I went, I love doing these kind of like art world road trips. And I went to Bentonville, Arkansas, to Crystal Bridges Museum of American Art, which is created by the Walton family. So in that context of that city, Bentonville, if anybody looks at the Arkansas is, kind of almost dead center of the kind of amazing and incredible American highway system that was built during the Great Depression. And so if you talk about what happened in America during the Great Depression, it was actually funding of infrastructure and funding of arts and culture. And actually something I discussed at the Ministry of Culture in Saudi on very early days. Of course, Saudi wasn't going through a Great Depression, but they were trying to economically diversify and encourage entrepreneurship, encourage, a creative economy, as the book attests to. And so Bentonville, there was something like no cultural institution for 50 square miles. So, of course, the Walton family, who have Walmart and a family of great wealth, have underwritten this museum, and it's free admission to all who want to come. They have a very serious schools program, and they bring in school children from this very large radius. And there was a study done, not self funded, so absolutely an independent study of what the ramifications of those school children coming to a museum. They got better grades in math. They got better grades in history. They like tested better on their SATs because, just being exposed to art and culture is not about, oh, let me learn you know, about Rothko or Picasso or, of course, now contemporary art, but it's about how do you open your mind and look at things in a different way. And I had an incredible teacher for my European history class who taught us European history through art. So you learn about the Renaissance or the Enlightenment through the artists and writers of those times and in those moments. And that really teaches you a completely different way of looking at the world, a different way of looking at business, a different way of being.
yeah. So in that difference, so many of the the great artists um, in the history of humanity, right, are their art challenges. It challenges status quo notions. It encourages people to think outside the box. Um, even sort of divisive, super divisive ideas. Um, I'm wondering how much you feel like there's a thirst and a hunger for the idea of creating those types of spaces also.
Well, I think if you look at an artist like Manal Doyen, I mean, she's the classic example to use, right? And she's an
Hmm.
example I use often. She,
Yeah.
for many years, as a kind of woman now, let's say mid-career artist in Saudi Arabia, but for many years was really an uphill battle. And she would make work that um, uphill battle in terms of career. I mean, she just persevered. She would, started as like an Aramco employee and engineer, grew up in an oil family in the Eastern Province, and then decided she wanted to be a full-time artist and was able to do that because she moved to Dubai. And Dubai, really was the first place to allow or open that conduit for artists from around the region. So you had, the Iranian diaspora, Indian diaspora, and then of course a lot of Saudis. So a lot of Saudis had, moved to Dubai as young professionals, and then of course in the creative industries. And Manal, very patriotic, very proud Saudi, but would be making art about the problems she faced as a woman. The very famous pigeon work, like the women's
Hmm.
the permissions that you needed to travel, the beads that was about the matrilineal a matrilineal line that it attested to the fact that so many people, didn't know their matrilineal descent. But actually, in fact, that's a universal theme. If you ask an
Yeah.
American, tell me your great great grandmother's name, they wouldn't be able to tell you either. Um, so I think Manal's work was really pushing those boundaries, but in a really thoughtful way. And that's what I kind of always, less now than before, but before would have to battle people who, kind of told me, oh, well, all these, Middle Eastern artists, they're just like, they're so political. And oh, somebody like a Manal, she's not accepted. And I'm like, absolutely not. She was always embraced in Saudi. And she was a proud, patriotic Saudi, but was talking about the problem, but doing it in a thoughtful way, not calling for revolution, but calling for change. And I think that's something very hard in the West to understand, um, that it has to be all or nothing. Um,
Yeah.
and that's just not the case.
So the book talks about um, a couple things, right? But I want to talk a little bit about art's role in cultural diplomacy in Saudi Arabia that's sort of outwardly focused, but then also I want to talk about that first, but then I want to talk a little bit about the possible like local knockdown effects, and what the local domestic agenda is for creating these institutions. So let's talk a little bit about the cultural diplomacy. What role does
So I think,
the art world look like? What role does it have for having in terms of cultural diplomacy?
I think it's just this idea of exposure. And I, you know, so often, I mean, you more than anyone will know that people really paint the Arab world with one brush. So whether or not, that's perhaps, it's not useful when you're really talking to somebody in like an extremely intellectual context. No, Saudi is not the same as Egypt. It is not the same as Lebanon. It is not the same as Gaza.
Yeah,
But
and
so many
Jeddah is
people
not
like
the
to
same
just
as
look at
Riyadh.
the. Exactly, exactly. I mean, completely. That's a perfect example again. Um, but it is useful when you are able to bring people to a place and show them world-class art in an incredible setting. So for many, many years, I was, just like a kind of friend to various organizations. So helped, was the first advisory board member at Edge Arabia, introduced my best friend to them, who then became their creative director. Then with the Saudi Art Council was, let's say, international ambassadoress for the Saudi Art Council, and bringing people over to the early shows of Edge Arabia, then to 2139, which is the Saudi Art Council show every year, was a way to expose them to culture and to showing them that there are artists. Because for also so long, people would tell me, oh, well, these countries are all just brand new countries. There's no art and culture there. There's no culture. And you kind of gasp and say, excuse me, but that's not possible when you have
That's
millennia
crazy.
old. Yes, but it was a very, very common refrain that I heard. Um, so, bringing artists and people, so Wolfgang Tillmans came very early on, Chris Durkan, who has, kind of written a lot about what is happening in Saudi and the wider Middle East, and been extremely supportive of that major museum director in the world. And, when you show people world-class art, they can't turn away from it then. They then, support it in the context of their own work, their own cultural institutions, their own collections. And it really, those little reverberations make a huge difference. And as we know, like a ripple turns into a typhoon. And I think with the Biennale in particular in Saudi, so the Diriyah Contemporary Art Biennale and the Diriyah, the Islamic Arts Biennale under the Diriyah Biennale Foundation, um, are world class shows. It is an absolutely quality, you can go toe to toe with any major exhibition Biennale in the world. And that is what causes, people to have a kind of newfound respect. It's not just like, oh, here, see some art and, just accept it. No, these are things that you can be, proud of in any setting, and shows people that there is something of quality and interest happening there, and makes them understand people a lot more.
Have you
I
seen
think
that like
quality is the important word, by the way. Quality is like the
yeah.
key word.
Yeah. How are they achieving that quality?
Through hiring incredible minds and curators around the world, through people who have a deep understanding of the culture, and make that effort to translate it into a show.
Okay, so I'm going to ask a weird question, but here it goes. How can this all go wrong?
Mhm.
Because the
Thinking that
way
it's
you're
only
saying it,
about
right? The way you're saying it,
thinking
right,
maybe
sounds
it's
like
yeah.
that you're just like, you know, just press play, just like close the microwave door, press play, hire a bunch of
Oh,
people.
no,
They're
no,
super
no.
smart. Everything's
No,
great.
no, no,
And
no,
then,
no. No, no, you have to hire the right people. You have to do things thoughtfully. You have to think about them. You have to think about the consequences of what you've done. You have to assess. You have to kind of constantly self-critique, I think, is an incredibly important, aspect of everything we do. I don't know, maybe this all goes wrong because it's too much too quick, but at this point, people are so hungry for everything that it hasn't gotten to that point yet. So perhaps, you get to that point where you are able to be more nimble and you already have the things, so then you modify them. I'm thinking of like one major kind of actually cultural happening. And I will, kind of, I was an early, let's say I was an early adoptee of it and then an early critic of it was the Culture Summit in Abu Dhabi. And I went the first year. It was the first year. It was okay. The second year, there were, definitely problems. But now it is this incredible platform. And, I think what I'll say chapeau and really bravo to them is that they were able to fix whatever, wasn't really working and working with the right people to make it an amazing kind of coming together of world-class cultural leaders, um, and making it like a great moment.
yeah. Okay, I want to talk about the domestic agenda, right? Um, the number of meetings I've had with people who seem to be obsessed with the creative economy is like nauseating.
Yeah.
So many people are obsessed with the creative economy, and so many of them I don't even think have a working definition that they are satisfied with. Not that I have a monopoly on the definition. I feel like they also don't have a, a definition. So for for our listeners, for this small community of people that we're talking to right now, why is the
Yes.
creative economy useful? Why are so many people thinking about it? And what is the creative economy?
Well, sitting in a country that also, here in London, a country that actually has more from arts, culture, and fashion, contributing to their GDP than finance, but yet is determined to squash all of that because they think it's not important, because you can't quantify necessarily, in the ways that a government thinks they can, how much arts and culture brings back into your country. I would say a creative economy is about all of those aspects of work, entrepreneurship, industry, uh, that is perhaps outside of banking and, your basic goods and services. And what's so important about it is that that's what brings you the best quality of life. It also brings people a sense of, kind of accomplishment and joy in their city. And I remember being in a black cab in London, very early days in my kind of career here. And I was going to Tate Modern. And the taxi driver, in his very, very rich way, he's like, "Oh, you're going to this museum." And he, of course, didn't realize I lived here. He thought, with my very American accent, I was a tourist. I said, "Yes, I'm going to visit." He said, "Oh, well, I've never, I don't go in there, but I know that it's amazing for London. So it's great that you're going." So, even that, I'd said to him, I was like, "It's open to the public and it's free. You should go." He said, "Oh, okay." And then actually Hans Ulrich Oberst, he told this story in Saudi. So Hans Ulrich, this renowned curator, came to Saudi with me, for a really incredible trip to experience Saudi for the first time and to come for the first Biennale curated by Philip Tenari. And Hans Lorck told this story to everyone as like arriving to the Serpentine with his cab driver. These cab driver like moments are quite important in London, actually. I think everyone has one.
Yeah.
And the cab driver was like, "Oh, you work here?" And he said, "Yes, I work here." I was like, "Oh, well, this isn't a place for me." And Hans Lorck said, "Why not?" He said, "Oh, well, it's not for me." He's like, Taylor was like, "No, this is open to the public and free for all." Like, "Oh, well, my daughter's an architect. Maybe I should tell her to come." Taylor said, "Yes." And kind of opened his world to this person that, thought that it wasn't for him. And I think that, for all of us to think what a creative economy does for a society and for your sense of pride and where you live and what you do, you can just see that even now in Saudi. Okay, maybe you don't have museums yet, but just, and you can't quantify this. So really, let's say bad governmental decisions in which I am living right now in the UK are let's slash funding. Let's not like help the museums. But good government decisions like what's happening in Saudi right now are let's augment them. Let's support them because that's what makes people feel good to live in the place that they live and want to be there.
Yeah. Yeah. It's yeah, it's I definitely I see it in many different ways. I really wonder what the ceiling is because so much of the creative economy, let's say in Saudi right now, is really top down, um, is being stimulated from top down um, effects. Which is totally normal. They're like stimulating a muscle. It's as if like you had an
Mm,
atrophied muscle and you're doing physical therapy and you're going in, they connect all the little pads and zzz, 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 zzz. Totally, I understand that idea. Anyone who's done physical therapy has gone through those pads, right? And you're slowly building the muscle. I totally get it. At what point do we undo the pads? At what point do we let bad
mm,
ideas fail? At what point do we let the economy live and die by their own merits? And if it is going to
mhm,
be a creative economy, let them create their own ideas. And some of them lose, some of them win, some of them are good, some of them aren't bad. When does that
mhm.
actually happen?
Well, I guess 2030, right? That's the deadline. Um,
7 years left.
yeah. Um, well, I think it's create things first, right? So, Field of Dreams, build it and they will come. Um,
Yeah.
Build these things and then and even now though your building is being repurposed. You had this really fun, cool street art festival. They were using, I believe it was an old hospital. And so instead of like tearing these buildings down and rebuilding something, using them again, the Jacks district, I think is something really exciting to look at. And seeing how that will develop and kind of take on a life of its own. But I think once you actually have these like physical spaces and institutions, you will see how they're being used and even uh evolving. So Final Awal, this really lovely kind of almost Kunsthalle space. It's a bookshop and a cafe in the diplomatic quarter in the DQ in Riyadh. Um, and has its own vibe. And you you see that in Miami now. You have the design district that, took time to take off, and you have Wynwood. I mean, I think some of the other questions to ask though are how are these things sustainable for all? Um, you know, when I was just in Miami for Basel, and a topic that came up over and over was, Wynwood is no longer affordable for the artists that made Wynwood cool and made Wynwood Wynwood. But how do you say to a private property developer, keep, your prices down, because to have, you need to have it all. So I think what is going to be the most important, and I'm hopeful that these policies will be instituted, is about like mixed use developments, mixed income, rent relief, supportive rent practices by, and especially now because you have such a kind of deep government involvement in that. Like maybe seeing what's happening in Alberta, that you're going to make sure that people aren't priced out of these places.
Yeah. It's definitely an issue. I mean, the idea of being priced out is, for me, something I have a concern with, because the art world in general, I think, is justifiably criticized as sort of being sometimes, or at least sometimes, looking like a playground for the rich and not really a space for everybody. Um, and I think there are a lot of smart people who are trying to not only undo the optics, but also have that not be true. Um,
Mhm.
do you feel like there are people who, at least in the rooms that you are in, are thinking very intentionally about that in Saudi?
Oh, very much. I mean, I think it's the idea that these places need to be for the people is a huge part of the conversation. And I think increasingly, we see that across institutions in the world and, museum spaces and cultures. And the one thing that is so, clear in Saudi and in the museums is that they are always open and free to the public. And it is something that really deeply upsets me when you think about what's happening in New York. These museums you hear every day, like, what is it, $35 a person admission at some of the, that's insanity to me. I mean, and in London, at least, and in Europe, institutions are free to the public because they're considered public. They're, made with public money. And then it's only the special exhibitions that you pay your admission ticket to. But anything that is a
Yeah.
public collection is open and free. And so I think that, in New York, it's what's happening in America now in general is, that things are really for the rich and that's it. And somehow being accepted as such. Um, and, of course, Art Basel is a private company. So, we have free admission, but we do have a very serious schools program. We support things within the context of our local communities in Basel, Hong Kong, Miami, and now, of course, Paris, which has a very deep public connection with the French Ministry of Culture and French agencies. Um, but no, I think in Saudi, that is something that we thankfully don't have to worry about.
Yeah. Okay. So one last question before we wrap up. I'm gonna put you on the spot, and I'll give you one of two questions to answer. You can answer both, or you can answer either. Either. If you
I'm
were to
up
put
for it.
together,
Okay.
okay, then I'll get you to answer both. Imagine you're speaking to a high schooler who is interested in art, and wants to go see museums but doesn't know where to start. Um, what are the top five museums or cultural institutions around the Arab world or focused on the Arab world that you're like, put these on your bucket list? You got to go check them out.
Tate Modern, 100%. I know it's not in the Arab world, but I think Tate Modern for me was a seminal institution that opened up the Arab world to the international art world and included the Arab world in those conversations from very, very early on. And incredibly important in doing so. Um, Within the context of the Arab world, in the Arab world, I would say it's more about places and communities. So let's say not maybe institutions, like one-off institutions. I would say one needs to uh, go to Beirut and one needs to, do a city day, or 2 days of visiting, cultural practitioners in their spaces. So, going around the city, going to Sursur, going to see Fair Similar, going to Mudfa, going to, like really experiencing that, but then also going to these heritage shops. I mean, I'm a big fan of this melding together of craft and culture. And I think, one of the first things I get asked when anybody ever goes on a trip, oh, where do I go shopping? Where can I go, buy something? Whether it be, buy a work of art from a gallery that they take home, which is another really important element of cultural tourists. Let's say, so when you go to Cairo, you go to Gypsum and you can, take home a great work of contemporary art. I'd say Marrakesh is another place that is incredibly important in the context of what's happening in the Arab world. And also the connection to Africa. So much of the Arab world looks to Europe, while when you go to Marrakesh, it really looks to Africa also, which I find a really interesting thing as being somebody who is African, North African myself. Tunisia, I have to give Selma Feriani a shout out because I know she's really done so much for her community and opening this space. And Selma is somebody so unique because in the context of, again, the ecosystem of the art world, she's has this incredibly professional gallery, is really well respected by the powers that be, let's say. So like the selection committees around the art world that, choose galleries to be in the fairs. She puts in really professional, really incredible applications, is always lauded for her professionalism and what she does. And I think to have an Arab woman be able to do that and be that representative means a lot to me. But it also just means a lot, I think, in the way that Arabs are perceived in the art world. And then, I'm more than five, sorry, but then
Yeah.
of course, we have to like talk about, going to Doha. And I personally can't wait to go back and see these public art installations out in the desert. I was not able, kind of to get there and do that. And of course, with the run up to the World Cup, there was a crazy amount of construction happening and quite difficult to do that. But I just had the honor of being on a panel with Zaina Adida, who is the director of
I love
Metaf, and
Zainab.
she was, going to love her. And, really talking also about the context of Metaf in conversation with universities. So Metaf is now on a university, kind of larger university campus. And as you know, I'm very involved with Brown University. We have it's called the Bell Gallery, and Carrie Mae Weems just had a show there. And she was saying what was so special to her showing at a university is that you have all these people, this community there that, are super academic, care about intellectualism, and it's just such a different audience for her than working in a gallery or a museum. And, Zaina was saying the same. And then, of course, when you go to Dubai, you have these jumping off points to Sharjah, to Abu Dhabi, and, each one occupying a very different like landscape. So in Dubai, you have incredible commercial galleries. So you have like the Third Line Gallery, which is probably arguably one of the first commercial galleries in the Gulf. Also showed very early days at Art Basel, run by this incredible woman, Sunny Raybar, and doing incredible work in that context. We discussed the museums in Abu Dhabi and Sharjah, the Biennale, and who are. I was having a conversation with someone once about who are kind of consistently showing, and this act of showing up is so well respected. You know what you can count on. You know that she will deliver you an incredible Biennale, an amazing museum program. And then now, of course, Saudi, the new frontier. But Saudi is vast, so there's no way to say, you can like go see everything unless you're going to spend like 10 days there, which of course many people can do. But if you have to do like these quick trips, I mean, go to Jeddah, go to Al Hada, go to Riyadh, and time it well so that you can see things all in once. Of course, you can go there at any other time of year, but I'd say come see the Biennale and then go to Desert X, and that's end of February, and then you can jump off to Jeddah, and visit Athad and visit some incredible artist studio spaces. So there's a lot to be done with cultural tourism. As I said, I did Marfa several times. I've done Rodent Crater. I've done Bentonville, Arkansas. I've been to now Shima, and I think such an amazing way to discover the world.
Yeah. Um, okay. The last question is, you've mentioned you being from North Africa. You are, you hail from, part of your family comes from Libya. Um, can you put together a list of Libyan artists and creatives or writers, cultural practitioners that you're like, you got to go check these out? Because we don't talk
Well,
about
I mean,
enough about
Hisham
Libya in
Matar,
general.
like, I mean, Hisham Matar is like our, you know, iconic star, and he has a new book coming out that I think really resonates with me, called My Friends, and is being released now as we speak. And Hisham, as somebody who is deeply Libyan, but of course has lived much of his life abroad, but really has been able to translate back this, I think, the haunting of being Libyan and having to live through the Gaddafi years. I mean, I was very lucky that I wasn't, there, to have to experience the everyday horrors and really, just this depression of living under mm, that tragedy of a person, and that tragedy of a regime. Um, but I think, Hisham Matar is really, he is that iconic person that I'd say you can really see so much Libyan culture, read so much of Libyan culture through him. You have Khalid Matawa, an incredible poet who is the poet in residence, or I think that's the term, at the University of Michigan. Um, really also actually met him through Hisham. And you see this, and actually, very now, there's a new young Libyan artist who I have yet to meet, but I'm desperately hoping to meet him when we're next in the same place, Saif Azuz, who is showing very prominently in our Basel, Miami Beach, who's half Libyan and half indigenous American. So quite a fascinating mix of, of ethnicities and of life stories, and is represented by a gallery in Northern California. And, I've had several people actually ask me, Selma Fariani asked me about him. And I think people are very, very excited to see the work that he does.
I love it. So if you're listening and you're like, oh my God, Hisham and Khalid sound amazing, we have really good podcast episodes with Khalid, and a really good podcast episode with Hisham. So go listen to those episodes.
See, it was all just a plug for Afik.
I was waiting for it. Alia, thanks so much. I should say that in addition to being a friend, you're also on our board of advisors, and you have supported afikra for a long time. So I'm glad that we have you on the series because your work is amazing. So thanks so
Thank
much for
you. Well,
everything.
thanks
I'm
for
glad
all
that you're
that
on
you,
here.
yeah, thank you. And, need to bring more voices of the Arab world out
Yeah,
and with each other.
for sure. Okay, everybody. Thanks so much. Go check out the other episodes and talk to you soon.